What if the greatest threat to society is not ignorance, but false certainty? What if a single man, armed with nothing but questions, could shake the foundations of an entire civilization? 5th century BCE Athens was the cradle of democracy, rhetoric, and public debate, yet it was also a city intoxicated by confidence. Politicians claimed wisdom, poets claimed insight, and sophists sold knowledge for a fee. Into this crowded marketplace of certainty walked Socrates, barefoot, unarmed, and profoundly dangerous, not because he taught doctrines, but because he asked questions. Socrates did not write books, deliver lectures, or establish a school. Instead, he stood in the agora and interrogated Athenians about justice, virtue, courage, and piety. He famously called himself a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the city awake from intellectual complacency. At his trial in 399 BCE, facing death, Socrates made a declaration that still echoes across centuries. The unexamined life is not worth living. This was not rhetorical flourish, it was a philosophical ultimatum. To live without questioning one's beliefs was, for Socrates, a moral failure. Ironically, Socrates claimed no wisdom of his own. As later summarized by Bertrand Russell, Socrates was wiser than others only because he knew that he knew nothing. This radical humility, combined with relentless inquiry, made him both revered and feared. His execution did not silence him. Instead, it immortalized his method. Welcome to the second lecture of the Crash CSS Philosophy series. I am Saima Sadaf, and today we explore not merely a philosopher, but a method of thinking that changed the course of intellectual history, the Socratic method. At the heart of the Socratic method lies a paradox that unsettles every proud intellect. True wisdom begins with admitting ignorance. Socrates repeatedly claimed that he possessed no knowledge of his own. This claim was not rhetorical modesty, it was a philosophical position. When the Oracle of Delphi pronounced Socrates the wisest of all Athenians, Socrates was baffled. He tested the oracle's claim by questioning politicians, poets, and craftsmen, only to discover that while they claimed knowledge, they could not defend it rationally. Socrates concluded that his only wisdom lay in recognizing the limits of his understanding. This stance later impressed thinkers like Bertrand Russell, who emphasized that Socratic wisdom consists precisely in knowing what one does not know. This humility was revolutionary in a culture where public prestige depended on persuasive confidence rather than intellectual honesty. The famous injunction, "Know thyself," was, for Socrates, not psychological introspection, but epistemic discipline. It demanded that individuals examine their beliefs, question inherited traditions, and resist passive acceptance of authority. According to moral philosopher James Rachels, Socratic philosophy ultimately revolves around a single ethical question: how ought we to live and why? But this question cannot even be asked sincerely unless one first admits uncertainty. By exposing ignorance, his own and others, Socrates cleared the ground for genuine learning. Ignorance acknowledged becomes a starting point. Ignorance concealed becomes an obstacle. In this sense, Socratic humility is not weakness but intellectual courage. It is the refusal to live comfortably inside unexamined assumptions. For CSS aspirants, this lesson is foundational. Analytical clarity begins not with answers, but with the honesty to say, "I do not yet know." The most distinctive tool of the Socratic method is the elenchus, a systematic form of questioning designed to test beliefs. Rather than presenting arguments of his own, Socrates would invite an interlocutor to state a definition, say of justice or courage, and then probe it through carefully structured questions. Each answer generated further inquiry, gradually exposing contradictions hidden beneath confident claims. The elenchus functions as a philosophical stress test. Its purpose is not humiliation, but clarification. As scholar Richard Robinson explains, Socratic questioning aims to wake men out of their dogmatic slumbers into genuine intellectual curiosity. The method is cooperative in form but uncompromising in logic. When inconsistencies appear, the speaker is forced to revise or abandon the original claim. Importantly, Socrates never replaced demolished arguments with ready-made doctrines. This is why many dialogues end in aporia, a state of puzzlement. Far from failure, aporia was success. It marked the collapse of false certainty and the birth of intellectual honesty. Socrates believed that removing error was more valuable than supplying premature answers. This method sharply distinguished Socrates from the sophists, who prized persuasion over truth. While sophists trained citizens to win arguments, Socrates trained them to examine beliefs. The elenchus thus served as both a logical and moral exercise. It disciplined the mind against complacency and arrogance. In modern terms, the elenchus resembles rigorous cross-examination, critical thinking, and peer review. Its relevance for CSS lies in its demand for internal consistency, conceptual clarity, and reasoned justification, skills indispensable for philosophical analysis and ethical reasoning. While the elenchus dismantles false beliefs, dialectic attempts to build understanding. Socratic dialectic is not debate aimed at victory, but dialogue aimed at truth. Socrates preferred short questions and answers over grand speeches, believing that knowledge emerges gradually through cooperative inquiry. Dialectic functions like an intellectual staircase. Each step, each answer, leads to another question, refining ideas and bringing vague notions into sharper focus. Although Plato later systematized dialectic in his works, Socrates practiced it organically in conversation. He gathered scattered opinions and tested them until clearer definitions emerged. Unlike rhetoric, which seeks persuasion, dialectic seeks understanding. It requires patience, humility, and mutual respect. Both participants are learners. Neither claims absolute authority. This made Socratic dialogue radical in a culture dominated by public oratory and competitive display. Dialectic also complements the elenchus. After contradictions are exposed, dialectic helps reconstruct thought on firmer foundations. It transforms philosophy from mere refutation into constructive exploration. Through this method, Socrates demonstrated that truth is not delivered fully formed, but discovered collaboratively. For CSS aspirants, dialectic models how to approach complex issues, constitutional morality, justice, governance, through layered reasoning rather than ideological assertion. It teaches that intellectual progress is not linear, but dialogical, emerging through disciplined conversation and continuous questioning. Socrates described himself not as a teacher, but as a midwife of ideas. In Theaetetus, he explains that just as a midwife assists childbirth without creating life, he assists others in giving birth to ideas already latent within them. This method is known as maieutics. Socrates claimed intellectual barrenness. He produced no doctrines of his own. Instead, his skill lay in drawing ideas out of others and testing whether these offspring were genuine knowledge or mere illusions. Through questioning, he helped interlocutors articulate beliefs they had never clearly examined. This approach implies a radical epistemological claim. Knowledge is not simply transmitted from teacher to student, but awakened through reasoning. Learning becomes an active process requiring effort, reflection, and self-correction. The teacher's role is not authority, but facilitation. Maieutics also carries ethical weight. It respects the learner's rational capacity and autonomy. Rather than indoctrinating, Socrates empowered individuals to think for themselves. This explains why his method was both admired and resented. It undermined intellectual dependency. In contemporary education, this approach underlies problem-based learning, critical pedagogy, and Socratic seminars. For CSS candidates, it reinforces a crucial insight. Memorization without understanding is barren. True comprehension is born only when ideas are interrogated, refined, and owned through reason. For Socrates, philosophy was never abstract speculation, it was fundamentally ethical. He believed that the purpose of inquiry was to discover how one ought to live. Central to this view was the claim that virtue is knowledge. According to Bertrand Russell, Socrates maintained that no one does wrong knowingly. Evil actions arise from ignorance, not deliberate malice. This position leads to a striking conclusion. If a person truly understands the good, they will act accordingly. Moral failure, therefore, is intellectual failure. From this perspective, education becomes moral reform, and philosophy becomes a practical necessity. Socrates also argued that virtues are unified. Justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom are not separate traits, but interconnected expressions of rational understanding. This is why he relentlessly sought precise definitions of virtues, believing that clarity would guide action. This ethical intellectualism challenges common assumptions. It denies weakness of will and insists on the supremacy of reason. While later philosophers would critique this optimism, Socrates' view underscores his faith in rational self-governance. For aspirants of civil service, this ethical framework is deeply relevant. Governance demands not only technical knowledge, but moral clarity. Socrates reminds us that ethical leadership begins with understanding, and that ignorance at the helm is the most dangerous vice. Socratic philosophy is filled with paradoxes designed to shock complacent thinking. Perhaps the most famous is the claim that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. To modern ears, this sounds counterintuitive, but for Socrates, committing injustice corrupts the soul, while suffering it does not. Another paradox is the assertion that no one desires evil. All human action aims at what appears good to the agent. When people choose wrongly, it is because they misunderstand what is truly beneficial. This reinforces the thesis that virtue is knowledge. These paradoxes were not intellectual games. They forced Athenians to reconsider deeply held assumptions about success, power, and happiness. Socrates measured a life not by wealth or status, but by moral integrity and rational coherence. His own death embodied these principles. Rather than escape execution by abandoning philosophy, Socrates accepted the verdict, arguing that violating the law would harm the soul more than death ever could. In doing so, he transformed philosophy into lived commitment. For students of philosophy and public ethics, Socrates offers a demanding ideal. Reason must govern desire, and justice must override convenience. The examined life is not comfortable, but it is the only life worthy of a rational being. Socratic philosophy comes alive in the dialogues recorded by Plato. In Euthyphro, Socrates dismantles conventional definitions of piety, exposing reliance on authority rather than reason. In Meno, he famously questions an uneducated slave boy, guiding him to discover geometric truths, suggesting that knowledge lies dormant within the human mind. These dialogues illustrate Socrates' method in action. He never lectures or dictates conclusions. Instead, he leads others step by step toward self-realization. The process is slow, demanding, and often uncomfortable, yet it produces intellectual ownership rather than passive acceptance. Most dialogues end without definitive answers. This was intentional. Socrates valued honest uncertainty over false clarity. His goal was not to close inquiry, but to open it. Pedagogically, this approach revolutionized education. It replaced rote instruction with inquiry-based learning. Philosophically, it laid the foundation for critical thinking as a discipline. For CSS aspirants, these dialogues serve as training grounds in analytical rigor. They demonstrate how definitions are tested, assumptions exposed, and arguments refined, skills essential for philosophy papers and ethical analysis. Despite its power, the Socratic method is not without limitations. Critics point out that many dialogues end in aporia, leaving readers without positive conclusions. While this fosters humility, it can also frustrate systematic knowledge building. As noted by interpreters of Bertrand Russell, Socratic dialectic is more effective in ethical inquiry than in empirical sciences. Questioning alone cannot discover new facts about the natural world. Experimentation and observation are required. Later thinkers, especially Aristotle, sought to move beyond Socrates by developing structured systems of logic and classification. Yet even Aristotle acknowledged Socrates' foundational role in defining ethical inquiry. Modern philosophers like Roger Scruton continue to defend Socrates' central insight that a life without examination is not fully human. Even if the method has limits, its spirit remains indispensable. Socratic questioning may not answer every question, but it ensures that answers are earned, not assumed. Its value lies not in certainty, but in intellectual integrity. Socrates' influence extends far beyond ancient Athens. Through Plato and Aristotle, he shaped the entire trajectory of Western philosophy. Roman thinkers like Cicero credited him with bringing philosophy down from abstract speculation into everyday life. In the modern era, thinkers from the Stoics to John Stuart Mill have praised Socrates as the embodiment of intellectual integrity. Mill's famous declaration, "It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied," captures the enduring appeal of examined dissatisfaction over comfortable ignorance. Today, the Socratic method survives in law schools, ethics committees, classrooms, and democratic deliberation. It teaches that authority must answer to reason and power must submit to scrutiny. For CSS aspirants, Socrates offers more than historical knowledge. He offers a method of thinking, a discipline of questioning, and an ethical stance toward truth. To study Socrates is not merely to learn philosophy, but to practice it. And that ultimately is his greatest legacy: the courage to ask, the humility to doubt, and the resolve to live an examined life. As we conclude today's exploration of the Socratic method, remember that philosophy, as Socrates taught us, does not end with answers. It begins with questions. If this lecture helped you think more clearly, question more deeply, and prepare more confidently for CSS philosophy, then this journey has been worthwhile. Thank you for giving your time and intellectual attention to Crash CSS Philosophy series. If you found value in this video, do subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon so you don't miss upcoming lectures, and share this with fellow aspirants who believe in the power of reasoned inquiry. In the next video, we will move further into the foundations of philosophy, building on the questions Socrates left behind. Until then, keep questioning, keep examining, and I'll see you in the next lecture.